Are diverse groups more innovative? Do they always outperform homogeneous groups? Social scientist David Livermore, an expert in global leadership and cultural intelligence, developed a 4-quadrant model to relate effectively across culturally diverse situations which transcend ethnic, organizational, generational, gender, and other contexts. As president and partner at the Cultural Intelligence Center, he has provided training and consulting in more than 100 countries. Livermore has authored 10 award-winning books, including Leading with Cultural Intelligence and Driven by Difference: How Global Companies Fuel Innovation Through Diversity. Please welcome David Livermore.
Thank you, GLS. I want to start by sharing a story with you. This is an experience that happened to me a number of years ago when I was in China speaking for about 10 days straight, multiple speaking engagements every day. I got into about the 3rd day of this rigorous 10-day speaking tour, and I felt like I had started to find my stride. I had gotten through the worst of the jet lag. I found a good cadence with my interpreter, and I felt, most importantly, like I was beginning to find ways to make our content relevant to the various Chinese audiences. And so I started my presentation feeling good on that 3rd morning, and what I didn't know was that my interpreter was not translating the story that I was sharing with which I was beginning my presentation. And instead she said, "So our speaker this morning is doing what a lot of North American presenters do. He's telling a story that he thinks is funny." I go on and I tell the next part of my story, and she says, "I've heard this story a couple times now over the past couple days, and I'm struggling to see how it's relevant." I go on and tell the next part of my story. She says, "But we don't want our esteemed guests to lose face, so when I cue you, please laugh very enthusiastically." Sure enough, right on cue, I tell the funny part of the story. The whole room erupts with laughter. And I'm like, yes, this is what culturally intelligent leadership looks like. Not only have I crossed multiple time zones and language barriers, I've even crossed the barrier of humor. And it was only several days later that somebody said to me, "You know she's not actually translating the first 5 minutes of your presentation, right?" And I want to suggest to you, similar to a theme that we've been hearing throughout GLS, that oftentimes it's our mistakes and how we learn from our mistakes that are the best tools for learning how to improve our cultural intelligence far more than our so-called successes. And cultural intelligence is quite simply the capability to work effectively with people from different backgrounds. That might be an American and Chinese. It just as easily might be a group of millennials and boomers, 2 people from different ethnic groups having grown up in the same community. And I want to share with you some of the seminal insights that have come from the research that my colleagues and I have been privileged to do for the last 20 years across more than 100 countries around the world, and suggest to you some ways that this may bear relevance for all of us as influencers and leaders in our respective organizations. The first characteristic that defines the culturally intelligent leader, from having looked at more than 100,000 leaders around the world, the number one characteristic that we found describes the culturally intelligent is not the number of languages they speak. It's not their own ethnicity and cultural background. It's not the number of places they've traveled. The number one characteristic of the culturally intelligent is their curiosity, or something that we refer to as their CQ drive. That is the ability, when confronted with something that's different from what's familiar to me, to lean in, seek to understand, and go, I wonder why that is. I wonder what it was about that introductory story that was so problematic that my translator couldn't find herself to actually share it with the respective audiences. To be quite honest, my initial response when I learned that she wasn't interpreting it was not, "Oh, I wonder why that is." I became very judgmental, defensive. What? What do you mean she's not translating the story? And then why doesn't she just tell me if the story's a problem? But what we're getting at with a culturally intelligent response is to start with not trying to evaluate, whether I'm right and you're wrong, but can I actually see this issue in this situation through your eyes the way that you are before we figure out who's right and who's wrong or which approach is better or different? And so one of the things that you might think about as you seek to expand your influence with people from different backgrounds is how do we develop this sense of something that we call perspective taking? Perspective taking is something that hopefully we do all the time as leaders. When we invite someone out to dinner, what's the kind of place where they would enjoy going to dinner, not what's the kind of place where I would enjoy going to dinner. Oh, we do this when we buy a gift for someone. Well, what's a gift that they would find meaningful? And so for us as leaders, before we even get into trying to figure out which political ideas are better than the others, what does it look like for us to step back and go, let me see if I can really understand how you're viewing this situation before I need to start evaluating and judging it. I have a sense that in our communities all across the world, we are in desperate need of culturally intelligent leaders who are not fearful of difference, but who will lean into it and say, help me understand what's going on here. The second capability that emerged among the culturally intelligent leaders is they have what we call high CQ knowledge. This would be something that's very familiar to us as leaders. This is the idea of having a decent understanding of similarities and differences that exist between millennials and boomers, or between Africans and Europeans. These would be things like different leadership styles or a different approach to communication. Do we prefer a more direct communicator who says, your story doesn't work, change it, or a more indirect approach that might be there? And so one of the ways that we often interact with leaders about this is to have them take something like our cultural values profile or others that are available in the broader world of cross-cultural work to say, where do you as a leader fall on the scale of direct versus indirect communication? And how does that compare to the dominant preferences and norms of the cultural groups with which you work? And how does that further compare with the dominant norm in your organization? How does that play out the way that your leadership is perceived? When we think about CQ knowledge and the grasp of cultural similarities and differences, of course, it's not that just cultural differences have the final say. When we're leading organizations, our organizations themselves have cultures and have values and have objectives that need to be factored into it. And for those of us who come from a faith perspective, we have our personal beliefs and value systems that also have to intersect alongside of cultural differences. So what does it look like to put those things together? There's some fascinating research on this, specifically as it relates to the Christian faith and how different Christians around the world view different teachings of Jesus. And so there's one particular study done by a scholar, Mark Powell, who wanted to talk to a variety of ministers around the world and ask them, why is it that in Jesus' teaching of the prodigal son, the young boy who asked for his inheritance early, why is it that the prodigal ends up in the pig pen? So he asked a group of Russian pastors, tell me, what do you think? Why does the prodigal end up in the pig pen? Russian pastors say, well, it's easy, it's obvious. He's in the pig pen because there was a famine in the land. Okay? Interesting perspective. Goes to a group of pastors in Tanzania. Tell me, why is it that the prodigal ended up in the pig pen? Easy, it's obvious. It's because no one gave him anything to eat, reflecting their very communal collectivist orientation. Comes to the American pastors from the US. Why is it that the prodigal ended up in the pig pen? More than 90%. Easy, it's obvious. It's because he squandered the wealth that he'd been given, according to Dave Ramsey's teachings on financial stewardship. So why is it that the prodigal ended up in the pig pen? Well, for those of you who come from a Christian faith perspective, we don't really care what the pastors think about why the prodigal ended up in the pig pen. What did Jesus actually say about why the prodigal ended up in the pig pen? Okay, fair enough question. So if you look in Luke chapter 15, you read in verse 13, he set off for a distant country and squandered his wealth in wild living. Praise God for the American pastors who know how Jesus teaches, right? Hang on. Next verse, after he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country. Okay, well, at least then the Europeans and the Americans have this thing figured out, right? 2 verses later, he longed to fill his stomach, but no one gave him anything. All three perspectives on why he ended up in the pig pen are there. There are wrong answers to why the prodigal ended up in the pig pen. We can't make data say whatever we want it to say. We can't interpret news to be however we want it to be. We can't interpret a leadership issue to be whatever we say it is. But I'm often skewed by my cultural perspective to focus on one thing at the expense of other things. And so this is one of the great benefits that happens from having a diverse group of leaders surrounding you, is we get the benefit of a cacophony of voices looking at a situation and looking at an issue that isn't interested in saying my way is more important than yours, but how do we together learn from the different perspectives and what comes from that? And so what might it look like for us to examine and develop this capability in ourselves and those you lead? Well, a key example would be to take one of the talks from GLS and with a diverse group of leaders say, what did you see as being the primary takeaway? And learn from the differences of how different generations and personalities and cultural backgrounds will surprise you by what they saw as being the most important takeaway for them. Take a Harvard Business Review case study. Look at some particular leadership issue that you're facing and benefit from the different perspectives that are there. Culturally intelligent are curious. They have a high level of drive that's motivated to seek to understand rather than live in fear and close themselves off. They have a high level of knowledge that seeks to understand cultural differences. But the third capability that emerged in our research is actually the one that most specifically relates to leadership. The core characteristic that set apart the culturally intelligent leaders from just culturally intelligent individuals was their ability to do what we call CQ strategy. That is to channel their curiosity and their understanding into a strategy that actually works. Eventually, we have to have something to teach on Sunday morning about why the prodigal ends up in the pig pen. Eventually, we have to make a decision about what direction we're going to take as a company when we're trying to roll out a new initiative. I would suggest to you that many times what happens is in our cultural sensitivity training efforts and diversity efforts, we do a whole lot on curiosity, getting people to see why they need to care and teaching them why this needs to matter, but we don't do a whole lot on teaching them strategy. What might it look like if one has a high level of drive and some knowledge, but not very much strategy whatsoever? Let me show you a video that may be familiar to some of you that gives us kind of a comical look at what it might mean to be very curious, have some understanding, but no strategy whatsoever.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah, Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
So, My apologies to our sites around the world for a very US-centric example, but perhaps you can relate to examples that exist in your own context. What we've actually found in our research is that if you do diversity training or cross-cultural management courses that are just focused on teaching people about the differences between Koreans and Germans or millennials and boomers, you actually make the situation worse, that you'd actually be better off to do nothing rather than just teach people about differences and then walk away. Because it ends up, well, perhaps an over-the-top example, looking something like this, where someone's really curious now, but now they're starting to put people in boxes all over the place. And the leaders with a high level of CQ strategy are aware that one might have a different approach to how you're going to conduct a performance review with someone, or how you're going to motivate a team, or how you're going to cast vision, but then follow the cues that they're getting back to try and figure out what to do with that. So for me, a couple days into my speaking tour in China, after I had begun to learn about what was going on, the individual who came up to me and said, so I'm not sure if you're aware that the translator's not actually sharing your story. And as I shared with you, initially I felt defensive, but over time, as I began to have my curiosity piqued and say, so help me understand what's going on here, began to find out that the organizers that had brought me in originally had been trying to tell me for weeks that they didn't think this story was going to work real well. And I was coming at it from my North American perspective saying, a self-effacing story is a great way for me to demonstrate humility, show that even though supposedly I have some expertise in this area, even I make mistakes. And from their point of view, we've brought this esteemed researcher from the other side of the world, and the first thing that our guests hear from him is how he's failed miserably at actually doing it himself. This is now losing face for all of us. And regardless of whether or not their point was accurate or mine, the point that I needed to think through then is, how am I authentically true to myself as a presenter, as a leader, while also having a strategy that's not going to undermine the way that other people hear about it? And so one of the things that you might think about as you seek to develop CQ strategy, as we call it in yourself and others, is before doing a task that's very familiar to you as a leader, running a meeting, facilitating a global call, sitting down and doing an interview, when it involves someone who comes from a different cultural background, just take a couple minutes beforehand and think about, wait a second, is there anything about this approach that might not work as well for someone coming from this background? Do I need to make some adaptation to how I go about it? And that leads to the fourth and final capability that consistently emerges among culturally intelligent leaders. They have what we call high CQ action, wherein eventually then we have to ask, how much should I adapt, and when should I not adapt? When is adapting trying too hard and looking like the buffoon in the video just did? How do I find that equilibrium toward being true to myself and being an authentic leader, but also knowing that the authenticity that I was after in demonstrating trust and credibility with a Chinese audience had to look somewhat different from how I might do it in a different kind of audience? So there's a few things that I'd encourage us to think through as we consider to adapt or not, or how much to adapt. And one question you might consider as you think about the different groups represented in your organization is the group that's unfamiliar to you coming from what we call a tight or loose culture? So a tight culture would be one that has very rigid standards of this is the one right way to give a talk. This is the one right way to cast vision. This is the one right way for men and women to interact with each other. And so in a tight culture, it's going to be far more important that you have a strong understanding that if I don't adapt to their norms, I'm going to be perceived in a way that's different than what I intend to be perceived. A loose culture, I would suggest that many of us that participate in something like the Global Leadership Summit would say, part of the value is we want to hear from lots of different disciplines and backgrounds and cultures and genders and all different kinds of ideas, because it doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily adopt it and do it just like you've done, but a loose culture would be one that's much more comfortable with the diversity of perspectives that are there. I think it's also very important to ask, and will adapting compromise the organization or me? There are times that I'm very well aware that there's a cultural norm and an expectation of me to behave in a certain way that I'm unwilling to do as a person of faith. or that I'm unwilling to do because of my commitment to women, or whatever the variable might be. And so same thing for organizations. There'll be times where you might understand, oh, this is the norm of how business is done here, but sorry, we'll cease to be true to our own organizational values if we do that. And then I think we always want to ask the question, and will retaining our differences actually make us stronger? Hopefully what we're after is eventually allowing people to be able to fully bring themselves to work, to our organization, to our communities, and to not have to so fully adapt that they don't feel like they're authentic any longer. This happens both at an organizational level as well as at an individual level. We've been working with Starbucks for a number of years, and when Starbucks first opened up in China, they purposely made their Starbucks outlets in China look very much like a traditional Chinese tea house. So they primarily served teas with just a few coffee offerings. There weren't the big comfy chairs and long wooden tables like some of us may be familiar with in many of the Starbucks that we visit. And they were very much working to adapt to the local culture in terms of what was there. What happened? The Chinese were totally frustrated. What happened to my venti latte that I ordered when I visited Starbucks abroad, you know? Last I checked, we had a lot of great traditional tea houses before you ever showed up here, Starbucks. And so actually by adapting too far, they undermined the very value of what they were trying to bring. So a culturally intelligent leader is not one who says, oh, I have to fully adapt to wherever I am. Please no, that could be patronizing and very ineffective. But more than likely, some adaptation is going to be necessary in order to lead effectively and expand our influence. Number of the conversations that I get engaged in these days, and you pick up most any leadership article that's talking about diversity, you'll read something like, diversity leads to innovation. So it makes sense, right? You have access to a more diverse repository of ideas. It goes to reason that that'll help you come up with more innovative solutions. Problem is, it's not true. Have you ever been on a diverse team? Have you ever actually been with a whole group of millennials and a whole group of boomers trying to figure out a way forward? It doesn't automatically translate into, now we have a more innovative solution. For those of you who are like, whoa, where's he going with this? We actually wanted to look at this as a community of researchers, and so we spent a few years looking at a number of multicultural teams across multinational organizations around the world. We actually found that more often than not, homogeneous teams innovated and performed more successfully than diverse teams did, unless the cultural intelligence levels of the leaders in the teams were high. And when diverse teams had culturally intelligent leaders and teams, they way outperformed the homogeneous teams 3-to-1 on pretty much everything we looked at. Productivity, cost savings, employee engagement, and yes, innovation. So diversity absolutely has the potential to lead to more innovative solutions, but it's not automatic. It's not like, let's just get more diverse perspectives on our team and then we'll be good. No. You'll be stalled in gridlock and frustration and people who are trying to figure out why that person doesn't trust them, et cetera. But when led together with high levels of cultural intelligence, you can absolutely expect that diversity is a key opportunity for leveraging innovative outputs. So how do you know what your cultural intelligence is? In collaboration with GLS, we're happy to be able to provide you with complimentary access to the self-assessment of the CQ profile. If you're interested in doing that, there's information about that in the GLS notebook. For a short period of time, that'll be available for anyone attending the summit. That'll give you an indication of where you fall along these 4 capabilities of drive and curiosity, knowledge and understanding, strategy and action, as well as give you your own personal preference along 10 cultural value differences. Things like the direct, indirect, or more top-down or flat approaches to leadership. And here's the really encouraging thing. Regardless of how you score on our CQ assessment or someone that you're bringing in and onboarding to your organization, the research is very compelling that everyone can improve their cultural intelligence. Sometimes when I say that to people, they're like, really? Have you met my Uncle Harry? because I'm not sure everybody can become more culturally intelligent. And we all have that uncle, that Facebook friend that no matter what we say or do, we're not going to somehow improve their sense of curiosity and seeking to understand. But for anyone who has the desire to get better at it, the research is overwhelming that again and again we see growth and improvement for people through coaching, through training, through hands-on experiences, learning from mistakes, having people who coach you through that, and seeing that it brings all kinds of positive results. We see this with MBA students at Harvard. They take our assessment when they start their program, again, midpoint in the program again when they graduate, and watch a steady progression of how their cultural intelligence is developing through their coursework there. Similar in working with executives from a number of different companies around the world, including Google and Goldman Sachs, where people will see opportunities to gain some insights and develop their capabilities in this regard. But for me, the way that I have seen this personally, not only from our research findings, is also just through observing my own life and observing other leaders that I've been privileged to work alongside and see the way that they gain insight into their own need to adapt and improve while still being true to themselves. The way that I initially got engaged in this as a researcher was I was interested in studying the experiences of itinerant travelers, somebody who goes on business for a week or two to a place, or a short-term missionary who goes for a brief period of time, or a study abroad student. To what degree can we expect those individuals to gain insights into the local culture when they're there, and what might that look like? And so one of the ways that I collected my data was to have the subjects in my studies keep journals or diaries before they traveled, while they were there, and after they got back, giving me permission to look at them anonymously and see some of their insights. I've read enough of these diaries, particularly from US university and high school students traveling other places, that it takes a lot for me to be surprised. But I wanted to share with you excerpts from just one that was unusually jarring for me. Let me share with you just a few highlights. So this is from a US university student who travels for the first time off the continent to Peru on a study abroad program. Student writes, "This is our first day here. The challenges began as soon as we landed last night. The airport looked like a dilapidated barn, but they sure took baggage security seriously. They wouldn't let us have our bags until they checked the tags. I guess they have to do that here, otherwise people would probably steal them." The italics are what I highlighted and coded in reading through the journal. If you've been to that part of the world or are from that part of the world, you may well say, well, is that not in part why they check the tags? May well be. It was just interesting to me, of all the things they could have noticed within the first 24 hours of being there, that was what they noticed, and that's how they interpreted it. A couple days later, wow, the Industrial Revolution obviously skipped this place. Cool thing is, everything is so cheap. Let's go shopping. June 27th. We're staying in one of the expats' homes for a couple days while they're away. If we weren't here, the place would probably be robbed. Thank God for those university students keeping us safe from the natives, right? June 29th, student writes, "I taught today. They don't speak English here." I mean, what is wrong with those Peruvian people, right? So I had to use an interpreter, student says. Our non-American friends will love this one. July 4th, it's so weird to be here on the 4th of July. Being here makes me so thankful for our country. Why did I get the blessing of being born in America? What if I had been born here instead? Okay, now, like I said, this shouldn't have been overly surprising to me because I've seen some of these sentiments again and again. The problem is, it was my journal from my first university experience studying abroad. Yeah. Now that you all want a refund for the last 30 minutes, I'm a slow learner. And my first thought when I found this in my basement a few years ago was to destroy the evidence. You know? Fake news, didn't happen, I don't know what they're talking about, paper shredder. And then, as an eternal optimist, I'm like, wait. Like, that's the whole point. I didn't grow up going, you know what? I think I'm going to be culturally intelligent. I'm going to talk to the GLS someday about how they can be culturally intelligent. Like, I was the epitome of the ugly American. But hopefully, a couple decades later, and many mistakes and conversations and mentors and experiences along the way, I've moved a few clicks forward in the journey toward becoming more culturally intelligent. And that's my admonition to you. If our assessment's useful, take it, try it out, see what's there. But I don't really care how you score on our CQ assessment. What I'm most interested in is what does it look like for you between this GLS and the next one to move one click forward in the journey to seek to understand, to develop thoughtful conversations, and to find ways that difference can be a point of learning and opportunity to strengthen rather than weaken us. And what would it look like for you a couple years from now to be sitting here and go, you know what, we as a leadership team have moved a couple notches forward in further diversifying our leadership, further diversifying our influence so that we can more effectively serve in the multicultural, globalized, I would suggest increasingly polarized world. We desperately need leaders with influence who have a heart of compassion, who are driven with a sense of curiosity and seeking to understand, but then strategically use that to accomplish objectives that make a difference in the world near and far. Thank you so much for the way that each of you play a role in that.